So I would now invite our commentator to come forward to give us a response. You can sit there, or you can present here, that's fine. Patsy Spyer is a professor of anthropology and sociology at the Graduate Institute in Geneva. She's the author of Memory of Trade, Modernity's Entanglements on an Eastern Indonesian Island, editor of Border Fetishisms, Material Objects in Unstable Spaces, and co-editor of the Handbook of Material Culture. Her current book project focuses on the mediations of violence and post-violence in the religiously inflicted conflict in the Moluccas, Indonesia. So I would invite Patricia now to begin our discussion.
So both papers come at questions of the political, theological, political, theopolitics, and I'm not going to distinguish all those because you do that quite well, from a quite oblique angle. Since both papers, I think, quite, in Sonia's case more implicitly, in Ulrich's case more explicitly, really interrupt the ability to totalize in fundamental ways. And offer ways of thinking about how forms of sovereignty are exceeded and undermined, right? From again, in very different ways. So the key words here for Sonia, as you heard, are ambience, but also uncertainty regarding the positionality and the strategy of the Russian Orthodox Church in post-Soviet times. For Ulrich, the key words are suffering, as you just heard also, and vulnerability regarding or mobilized through, in your case, the figure of the migrant. Now, for Sonia, the notion of ambiance, she writes, implies something that is present and that shapes one experience of a social space without sort of hovering at the edge of vision, if you like, not really being noticed, not really being foregrounded or articulated. It's just sort of there. In her hands, this concept of ambience allows her to address how the Orthodox Church is strategically spreading, almost like an ink spot, slowly into space, if I understood you correctly, constituting and claiming forms and building forms of sacred jurisdiction, and doing so also, at least in part, by moving into some of the most intimate and often and extremely charged areas of personal failed family life in the eyes of the church. So abortions, suicides, unbaptized, Soviet types, and so on. So, and also by making some forays into politics. Well, in some respects, and certainly with respect to these politics, disavowing that they're actually doing so, right? So this demonstrates, as Sonia tells us, the power of the unsaid and implicit, that culturally speaking as well, and for the Orthodox Church, which is not a state church in post-Soviet Russia, but by default it is the go-to church in the country, right? Allows the church to gain and exercise influence without, as it were, anyone really noticing, right? So this is, I find, really interesting. So both the church is above politics, or profiles itself that way, and delicately exposes itself as a friend of politics, right? So it's all very delicate. Sonia's attention to ambiance fits, of course, within recent anthropological attunement to and concerns with the material-affective dimensions of social life, the production of social life, things like ambiance, atmosphere, environment. In my own work, I've tried to analytically specify something akin to what the Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz called the fog of war. So really trying to say, because it resonates with what I've been doing or what I've been hearing in the Moluccas, this book I'm trying to finish that you mentioned, this kind of weird ambiance that nonetheless is effective and productive. And one could perhaps also think of aura as a kind of wind, as something that molds people from without within, not quite sure, as another kind of influence of sorts, which is not, well, in this case, is brought out and visualized and therefore noticed, but otherwise you kind of wouldn't know it if you didn't probably pay a lot of money for the machines and, you know, the diagnostics and so on. So at issue for Sonia is how ways of ambience and uncertainty are also crucial forms of world making, world renouncing, world claiming, and also, at one and the same time, of the reconstitution and refiguring, reactivation, rededication of spaces that are linked to and create the place of the Orthodox Church. So Uri's paper offers a really nuanced overview of this kind of classic Schmittian political theology, decisionist political theology, right? That absolute, you're in or you're out. And then also an overview of the dialectical political theology, which is characteristic of Schmidt's critics, or the ones you focus on. As you heard, his engagement, among other things, is provoked by Saskia Sossen's remark that migration can really throw a wrench in the wheel of migration? No, in the wheel of sovereignty, yes. This was written early in the morning. Empirically speaking, that wrench already seems to kind of be there, right? Because insofar as the world is already in a process of denationalization, the wrench is crucial. And I think you're right, the wrench of the figure of the migrant. But it's already being, you know, hollowed out, prized apart, you know, the outside moving into the inside and so on. So that's already in place. That doesn't change your argument, but I think it's a double whammy or a double wrench in that respect. Okay, I thought it was quite interesting that one of the things you focus on or you point out is that migration, following Ben Habib, I think it was. No, not Ben Habib. Doesn't matter. That migrants, that the distinction between citizens and non-citizens doesn't work the way it used to because of the whole idea of human rights. That at least legally, in principle, migrants can appeal to certain rights. So religion steps in to say, wait a sec, there is this major distinction between citizens and migrants, between citizens and non-citizens, which I think is an interesting way of explaining, you know, what is often called the return to, you know, the return of religion as really asserting, and we're talking about Europe especially here, right? The difference between citizens and non-citizens.